Hello and welcome to this chess endgame featuring a knight sacrifice. So in this position, it is white's turn to move. And what would you do here if you had white to move? And the title gives you a hint here on what you might be trying to do, but it's interesting to try and figure out how you should play exactly in this position. And many times in games such as this, where the position is pretty close, the material is even, sometimes you have to use a sacrifice as the only way to break through the position and try and get a win. All right, and also in this kind of game, usually the knight that is more active will end up, knight and king that are more active will help you win. All right, let's take a look here. If we go to the analysis, so here the computer shows that knight to d5 is the move that white should make here. So after knight to d5, if the black knight would just capture and white would recapture, well then white would be able to gain access to black's position once the king recaptured here on d5, and he would be able to move to e6 and pick off this f6 pawn and then march his pawn up to queen. And so, I don't know, we could take a look at that. If this happened here, then, king to a4 would probably be the best move. And then white could immediately capture or go to capture over here. So capture, capture, and now it would take, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves for this pawn to queen, and this would only take, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. So the game, the computer here though recommends a4. Oh, and I see why, because this pawn will promote with a check on the king here. So I don't know, maybe this would be played. Well, then the king could move out of the way, but the problem is now the white king is picking off this pawn and can threaten to promote the other pawn. So, we could play it out a little bit further here. Queen, and then b2. But here, the queen could just move here, capture this pawn, and then pick this pawn off and promote the other pawn. So, white would be winning. And so if we go back to the beginning here, after knight to d5, this black's knight cannot capture here. That would be losing. So in the game, we have knight to g8 being played here to protect this pawn that's under attack, the f6 pawn. But then the knight is sacrificed here. And so if we go back and take a look at this, that is the best move in this position, a winning move. A4 is possible here with check, but for the greatest advantage and winning move, sacrificing the knight here. And then we have, let's see, knight captures. Although in the game, let's see if that's what the most recommended move was. Yes, to capture there. So then now the white king will be able to move up and infiltrate into black's position here. It looks like knight to e7 is the move that is recommended as the top move. And that's what was played in the game. But if we look at king to c7 here, trying to get the king up here around to help this knight and help stop these pawns from promoting after white moves in here. Now we have this move. Otherwise, the king could have moved up here and the knight would be trapped. But after a4, the knight can finally move out. Then a5, the game might continue with the knight moving over here to try and stop this pawn. But after this, now white will capture. And so the game may continue here, but the knight can stop this pawn, but white will be able to just capture this, and then the white king can move back. If black attacks this pawn, the white king can move back and then just start pushing forward the h-pawn. All right, so if we go back to this position, king to d5 was played, and instead of the king trying to move over and help on this queen side, we have knight to e7 with check. But white just moves up here, attacking the knight and protecting this white f pawn, and also preparing to pick off this f6 pawn. So after knight to c6, king captures. Now the king moves over, and king to g7. Now, if king to g6 were played, then we have this possibility of a fork with the king and the pawn here. And so in this position, it looks like it would be even. So white must avoid this. Even if white picked this off, then capture, attacking the knight, pushing the pawn forward. Well, now the knight would be able to hold off the h-pawn. And so now, if the pawn can't push forward, the knight would just capture, and then the king can stop this pawn over here. And so if we play it out a little further, here, f7 is played. If h7 were played here, well, then we have knight to f8, forking the king and the pawn. So the knight is attacked. Now the knight just moves back here, cutting off this h7 square. And if the king attacks, the knight just moves back and forth here, threatening this fork. So if the pawn would be pushed forward, then we have this fork here, which would pick off the h-pawn, and the king could stop the other a-pawn. All right, so in the game, knight to g6 cannot be played, or that would lead to a draw. So, king to g6 cannot be played. So king to g7 was played, preparing to pick off this h-pawn and allowing this f-pawn to push forward. So now we have knight to d4 attacking this pawn. The pawn moves forward. Now the king tries to come in and help, but the other pawn is picked off. And now after an attack on the f-pawn, the king protects it, and the knight tries to come in and help and also keep an eye on this pawn, but it's already too late. Black is definitely losing this position, even with a check here. Check. Now the knight has blocked this h-pawn, and even if this pawn is picked off, black cannot stop these pawns that are so far apart from each other. So we see here it is hopeless for black. Now the knight can stop this pawn, but this pawn is marching forward. And here black is losing and the computer shows a mate and 16. So if we go back to this position, just remember in these types of chess endgames, try and make sure that your king and your piece, whether it's a knight or whatever, your king and your pieces are more active than your opponent's. We see that white's king is kind of close. He's trying to fight for the center here, and he's kind of close to these pawns over here. And his knight is definitely better than black's knight here in this position. And so this move here, and then the sacrifice pulls the king away. It forces the knight to move over here and defend these pawns. And then the king is allowed to move up into black's side of the board, and then go over here and attack these pawns. So this knight just became way too passive. So in these types of endgames, definitely try and use your king and whatever pieces you have to your advantage, and try not to get them into a passive position. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this chess endgame featuring a knight sacrifice, and maybe you'll be able to use this type of sacrifice or something similar in your own games. All right, well, if you enjoyed this video, if you haven't already, please subscribe or like, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, everyone, and have a super day.